Welcome to the Jelly Pops Book Club, where we read book-to-screen adaptations and compare them to their screen counterparts. I'm your host, Julia Washington, and if you're new around here, I am a biracial writer and podcast host based in California. When I'm not facilitating this book club, I'm recording Pop Culture Makes Me Jealous, pouring candles, or painting greeting cards, all while trying to convince my dog to snuggle. On today's episode, we're diving into The Last Unicorn with our guest, Jacki Hayes. So a little bit about the book before we get into our topic. The Last Unicorn is a fantasy novel written by Peter S. Beagle. It was first published in 1968. It is the story of a unicorn who believes she is the last of her kind and embarks on a quest to discover what happened to other unicorns. In November of 2018, Atlantic Books published a review with this headline: "The Last Unicorn, still one of the best fantasy novels." The reviewer went on to say, quote, "It's not epic fantasy, but applied fantasy, which is to say readers aren't supposed to get lost in its invented world. We are supposed to import its lessons to our own world. In this uncertain age, when truth and falsehood are just rapidly converging talking points on the same blurry continuum, and wishful thinking is hopelessly mixed up with reality, The Last Unicorn urges audiences to do the things that need doing anyway, muddling through as best we can," end quote. So a little bit about our author. Beagle was raised in the Bronx and he graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a degree in creative writing. He is best known for writing The Last Unicorn and is the recipient of the prestigious Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and Mythopoeic Awards. I don't think I said that right. I'm so sorry. And a World Fantasy and Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America 2018 Damon Knight Memorial Grand Master, among other literary achievements. Okay, so before we dive into the discussion, let me introduce you to my guest. Jacki Hayes is a launch consultant with a bit of strategy and coaching who wants you to love launching. She partners with her clients to create custom launch processes that tap into their strengths, skills, personality, and lifestyle. She is the host of the podcast, Here's What I Learned. When Jacki isn't helping others launch their programs, you can find her reading, walking her dog, or enjoying all things Marvel. Okay, now here we go to the discussion. Talk to me a little bit about the first time you saw The Last Unicorn and the impact it had on your childhood, because it has to expand a little bit, when you and I were kind of talking about what topic for you to come on, when you mentioned The Hobbit, I immediately was like, we should do that one. But then I was like, no, because I'm not ready. But then when I watched The Last Unicorn, I was like, oh my God, unlocked childhood memories, sense memories completely unlocked, and it's an era that I completely forgot about. And so anyway, so I was like, yeah, let's talk about it. Tell me about the first time, the impact it had, all the things.
So I don't actually remember exactly the very first time I saw it. I was, oh goodness, when did it come out? Like 82-ish, I think?
Somewhere around there, 82, 84, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So if it was 82, which sounds about right, I would have been 7 years old.
Okay.
And I know I didn't see it at like a theater or anything like that. I saw it on regular TV. We must have at some point in my childhood when we actually had cable. And I remember anytime I saw that it was on, I would watch it.
Mm-hmm.
I was mesmerized by it. I was one of those little girls that had all the unicorn things ever.
Love that.
Yeah, and a lot of that came from two sources, the Serendipity books, if anybody remembers those, the Morgan Me, Morgan Mine, all of those, and then also The Last Unicorn. It was just, if there was something about unicorns, I then had to have it, had to watch it, had to, read it, etc. And I know that a lot of my love of fantasy also came from watching that and watching like The Hobbit, both of which the screenplays for those cartoons were written by the author of The Last
Mm-hmm.
Unicorn. So they
Yeah.
had the same feel to them, and the animation was very similar too.
Yes, and I think that's why when I turned on the screen version of The Last Unicorn, I was like, we could have picked The Hobbit, and because the same emotions would have hit.
Yeah, yeah, all the same nostalgia.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid The Hobbit because of the emotions that are attached there, but The Last Unicorn hit them too.
Yep.
When did you discover that it was a book? Because did you see the film version first, or did you read the book first?
So I did not realize, and I don't know how, because I'm probably sure somewhere in the credits it says adapted from.
Mm-hmm.
In my childhood, I didn't pay attention to the credits.
Right.
Who does? Even as an adult, sometimes I don't. And I don't know I even don't remember how I realized it was a book. I think maybe I was watching the movie as a grown up at some point and was like, this is a book. And so I did not read the book. I checked my Goodreads, and according to Goodreads, I did not read it until 2009. So there was a
Wow.
huge span of time between first watching the movie and actually sitting down as a grown-ass adult and reading the book.
Yeah. What was it like though to discover it was a book? Because I know when I'm like, oh, I loved this movie, and then you're like, oh shit, that was a book. Do I read the book? I mean, you read the book, but like, what was kind of the process you went through?
Yeah, so you know how it always is when it comes to like you saw in one format and you're
Mhm.
kind of nervous about seeing it or reading it in the other format. Usually it's the other way around. Like you've read the book
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you're going to watch the movie and you're terrified that they're going to destroy it. But this was a beloved cartoon movie that had such a huge impact in my life. I don't even remember now at this point how many times I've seen the film. Like literally, if it was on TV, I watched it. Um, then to discover it was a book, it was like, well, that's interesting. And I'm really curious. There was no fearfulness because I tend to find, with the exception of like practical magic, which the book and the movie is nothing like alike.
Right.
Usually I like the book version better. So it was like, oh, okay, well, let's see. And I think there was such a huge gap in time from the last time I'd watched the movie to reading the book that they felt
Mm.
like two complete different entities.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And there was so much paraphrasing that had to happen to make the book, even though it's a children's book, so not very long. They
Mm-hmm.
still can't fit all of that into, a cartoon that I don't even
Yeah.
think was a full 2 hours. It was
I
like
think
probably
it's
like
an
90 minutes
hour.
at the most.
Yeah, I think it's an hour 30. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I was
And there's
surprised about too, because I feel like the 80s with children's movies with animated stuff, they really did keep it short. I was shocked when I
yeah,
saw how long it was actually.
yeah, yeah. Because usually that in that time frame, they were like an hour usually.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a longer one. So for me, yeah, they were like two separate entities, two different things because there were so many more details in the book. I felt like some of the characters were different, like their personalities, their quirks, things
Mm.
along those lines were different from the book to the movie. Like the magician, the wizard, felt a lot more serious and a lot
Mm.
less comedic in the book than I felt like he was the comedic element in the movie, like the
Yeah.
goofball to bring lightness to it. And while he didn't feel like a heavy character in the book, didn't feel like he was inserted for that comedic
Mm.
relief.
Interesting. I wonder what the decision was there to sort of change it. Because what I have found, I guess you could call it research, because I read a lot of book to screen adaptations and compare them. When the author is very closely tied to the screen adaptation, there really isn't a huge vibe
Mhm.
difference. And I hate to use vibe because it's not a concrete example,
Right.
but that's what it is. Because when we read something, we have emotions, we have a mood, there's a tone that we feel. When we read books,
Mhm.
same thing. And that's the
Mhm.
disconnect. When we read a book, if the film doesn't hit the same tone, we immediately are like, that's trash. Why did they do this? They ruined it. That's usually the
Mhm.
root of the emotion. And then we can build on from there. But he wrote the screenplay. The author wrote the screenplay.
Yep, very much so. And yeah, so it's somewhere in there. There was a decision to either, and again, it could be my interpretation of it
Sure.
too,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the author's interpretation of trying to take this character who is developed through 200 and some pages and condense him down to an hour and a half movie where he makes limited, I mean, he's a fairly big character in the movie, but there's only so much time they can put for him. So how do you condense all of this one character into a movie? And that may
Yeah.
have been like the author thought in a book, those comedic elements are spread out so they may not feel as in your face, but he may
Mm.
have felt like bringing those, a few times that happened in the book into the movie, because for him, maybe that was the most important element of him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like taking a person like reality TV shows. It's all in the editing.
Yeah.
This person seems like a bitch on what you watch on TV, and you did not see the 400 hours worth of time that they were not that way. So,
Right, right. Kristen Cavallari has a story about how if she had known that they were casting her to be the villain, she wouldn't have done it, because the footage that they cut together very much makes her the villain of Laguna Beach and the
yeah.
Hills, which is,
And all of us would be like that if we
yeah.
if we were to take chunks of our life. That would happen. So,
Totally,
yeah.
totally. I do want to kind of pivot just real quick away from our outline, but the animation is so like it's so bright, it's so colorful, it's so
Mhm.
whimsical of the
Yeah.
screen adaptation. And I'm curious about if the book was that descriptive, because I haven't read it yet. It's in my queue.
Yeah. Yeah. I went back and I got to reread this to prepare for this. I did not get all the way through the book, but it was a very descriptive book.
Oh, I
And
love
not
that.
in a like an annoying way,
Sure.
but like you really understood. For instance, it starts with the unicorn in her forest, and it goes through this journey of her being like, wait a minute, she overhears a conversation that she's the last unicorn. And it's been a while since I've seen the film, but I felt like this introduction of this idea of her discovering that she was the last unicorn and her journey in that was much more prolonged and therefore much more
Mm,
emotional in the book than
mm,
it was in the movie. Like it was like this whole like I need to know, and finding herself trying to avoid the villages, but occasionally having to be seen, but nobody saw her as a unicorn because nobody believed in unicorns any longer,
right.
and all of that. Like, wait a minute, then what am I, who am I? It was just seemed to be so much more in the book than it was in the movie. But that animation, it's the same kind of animation that you see in The Hobbit. It's a
Hmm.
very distinctive, like you saw that kind of animation during that time frame. And for me, whenever I see animation like that, it immediately brings me back to my childhood.
Yeah, it's totally generation defining, because when you look even just 10 years later at the way animation not just only evolved, but how the way that children's television is getting animated in 1994, it's so different. And it's not, I want to walk back and say it's not necessarily the evolution of animation. I think that because like The Last Unicorn and The Hobbit are rooted in sci-fi, or not sci-fi, but fantasy, it lends
Mhm.
itself to a different type of tone.
Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
when I watched The Last Unicorn for our chat today, I immediately was like, okay, what present day does this kind of remind me of? And Steven Universe came to mind, and the way that Steven Universe
Mhm.
was animated. But that's also a very specific show for a very specific audience. So it doesn't, it's not like, what am I trying to say? Here's what I'm trying to say. In the 80s, there was a very clear, like, this is the animation for children. And then
Mhm.
here's animation for, like, there's the Disney animation, and then
Mhm.
there's everybody,
Yeah.
everybody else. But the everybody else was felt more whimsical. And I hate, because, like, Fantasia's whimsical,
Yeah.
you've got some Disney whimsy, but like the way that The Last Unicorn and The Hobbit are whimsical,
Mhm.
only to me, it feels like exists in fantasy.
Yeah, you don't see that. And as we're talking, I'm remembering, and I cannot for the life of me remember them, but there was like a whole genre of illustration during that
Hmm.
time period that was fantasy based. It was a huge movement at that time. I mean, that was about the time the D&D came out. And
Yeah.
so there was a lot of fantasy that was going on, high fantasy especially. And I do remember there being cartoons that were more adult driven cartoons at that
Right.
time along those lines. And there was an artist whose last name started with a B, and I can't remember, but they all kind of had the same color tone. They
Hmm.
all kind of had the same just feel to them. But as you were talking about, like what kind of animation today, I look at it, and a lot of times I see a little bit of anime in it.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
the Last Unicorn, if you look at the characters, they're bigger eyes, they're very thin, slender thing. People, there's just to me like a lot of, and even like the way they move feels very much like anime to me. So it feels like a precursor to that. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't consume anime in the way that, say, my offspring does, but in what I've
mhm,
seen, yeah, I could see that. I
mhm.
can totally see that. Holy
And the
buckets.
colors are bright, but they're also toned down. They're not like
Right.
primary blue. They're
Mhm.
still a bright blue, but it's not primary blue like you would see in Pokemon or whatever. So,
Right. Right, because The Last Unicorn is literally like, here is every bright ass color you could possibly imagine. And in the beginning, I was like, this could like if someone was on mushrooms, this movie would freak them out.
very much so. That's just what we're going to call that genre of animation, that style of animation. If you were on mushrooms, this would freak you out. I mean, we were talking about my childhood where we had HR Puff and stuff, and
Right.
the dragon, whatever.
Puff
I
the
can't.
Magic Dragon.
Magic Dragon. We had a lot of puffing going on and mushrooms
Yeah.
happening in my childhood. It seems like so.
That's a really good point. And then the 90s showed up and everyone freaked out and they were like, "What did we do?" And you're just like, "It's too late. You opened that door."
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe you already answered this a little bit, but when you first read the book, you already mentioned that because it was such a great time distance between having seen the film and having read the book. But did it impact your feelings at all about the movie? Like, did it change the way you felt about the movie at all?
I don't think so. Because it had been so long that there were elements that I couldn't, like if I was reading the book and I'm like, was that in the movie or wasn't that in the movie? So it was
Mm,
only like the big theme that I was like, okay, the big theme is still the same. Um,
yeah.
and I recognize these characters, but I wasn't able to say first, sometimes when you read a book and watch a movie back to back, you're like, you can be like, this is wrong, quote unquote
Yeah.
wrong. I think of it as wrong. And you can see the little fine elements. Like they didn't
Mhm.
say that, or a different character said that, or those kind of things. And there was such a wide time period between the two that as I was reading it, I couldn't say, like, oh, that wasn't in the movie, or oh, that was different in the movie. Like I remember slightly different tone difference.
Mhm.
And if I hadn't just recently reread the portions of the book, I wouldn't have even remembered that like that some of the characters were slightly different to me in
Mm.
vibe. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I really like your point though about how the distance sort of makes it so that the way they're their own entities, like they've become their own properties, because it is really
yeah.
hard when you do have a book that came out, within because I want to say books still get discovered within 3 years. Like it may have come out in 2020, but maybe someone, like, it's still commonplace for someone to like discover it 3 years later versus, well, I don't know. We just have so many books getting published nowadays. I don't have enough time. But versus when you have something like, for example, The Color Purple, which came out in the 80s and, it got a screen adaptation in the 80s, but now it's getting another adaptation because they adapted it for to be a musical, and then that musical is getting a screen adaptation. So it's kind of like we
Mhm.
have a generation far enough removed from the original book that maybe
Yeah.
all they know is the Oprah Winfrey Danny Glover movie.
Yeah.
Whoopi
Mm-hmm.
Goldberg, I can't forget her. Um, versus like right now we're recapping lessons in chemistry for our free community. And that book came out, I want to say in 2022.
Sounds right. Sounds
So
right.
it's still fresh in people's minds.
Yeah.
People are still reading it. It's still, I think it's still on the bestseller list. I'll have to confirm. So watching that screen adaptation, the book is fresh in my mind and it's very clear like
Yeah.
what the changes are. But if when I go in and watch The Color Purple, I would not be able to tell you what the differences are from the book unless I go back and reread the book because it's been 20 years since I've read the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wasn't able to be like, okay, this character felt a little different or this felt a little different
Mm-hmm.
until I finished the book and then went, okay, let's watch the cartoon again. Let's watch
Yeah.
it again. And that was when I was like, oh, here are the differences. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So how do you feel the book and or the film holds up now? Because when I watched the movie, I was like, I feel like this is, other than parents freaking out and like nowadays being like, no, this looks too much like a drug trip. Like that was my first thought. But I don't know, some parents might be into it. I don't know.
Yeah. Really, I don't think um I think it holds up over the years as much as something like Little Mermaid does. Because in
Mm,
reality, if you read the book or you watch the movie, there are some crossover elements between Little Mermaid and in this situation, in that
yeah.
her ability to be able to communicate and the love story and all of that, it feels a little bit Little Mermaid to me.
Okay.
Um, just because I mean she wasn't really able to verbalize and communicate as well, because she was a unicorn, she thought differently, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
um uh so that element I feel is, it's a classic to me. I don't watch that or read the book and think, oh, this is, yeah, this is, bad or whatever. I mean, it's very white. There is that. There
Yeah.
isn't a single character of color. It is heteronormative. So
Mm-hmm.
those things are there. But to me, The Last Unicorn is very similar to Snow White and Little Mermaid and all of those things. It's a modern fairy tale. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that's very prevalent when you watch the film. Like, oh, this is a fairy tale. We are definitely in a fantasy land. Um, which is kind of fun sometimes. But you make
especially right about now.
yeah. But you make a good point about like it being very white and very heteronormative because I feel like fantasy really didn't start getting diversified until the last handful of years. Like I can't think of any
Mhm.
fantasy books from my childhood that weren't very clearly rooted in some version of patriarchy or misogyny and like
Well,
the cast is completely white.
if you think about, like, here in America, we were introduced to Grimm, which is
Yeah.
all in Europe. So it is going to be all white. It is all going to be patriarchy. There's going to be elements of the Christian church in it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's not until you actually look for other fairy tales, like actively seek out fairy tales from other cultures,
Mm-hmm.
that you're like, oh, fairy tales exist in other cultures, and not everybody is white. Generally, there tends to be heteronormativity in most fairy tales that are
Yeah.
set back in time. There might be some queer elements if you're looking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in the United States, it was all based on Grimm or Aesop's Fables or Hans Christian Andersen,
Mm-hmm.
all based in Europe. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, all sad little weak women needing to be rescued. Sorta. I mean, Red Riding Hood, some versions of her, she is a badass and takes control.
well, and a lot of them, if you read the original versions, they're gory and
Yeah.
they're a lot more independent characters, and they've evolved so much over time. And some of the fairy tales, even you can go back and you can see that they're actually based on mythology from that
Mm-hmm.
era. So
Mm-hmm.
they were actually, gods or goddesses. But it's just like the mythology that was taught in my schools. It was all Greek mythology and Roman
Right.
mythology. We didn't learn about, mythology from India. We didn't even learn about indigenous people from the land I live on. We didn't even learn
Right.
about any of their mythologies. So yeah, of course we're only gonna also teach the white stuff in the schools. So
Mhm. It would be interesting, not to pivot back to whiteness, but it would be interesting if they did do a closer to the text version of some of these fairy tales, because they are, like you said, they are pretty gruesome. They are pretty intense. Like the cautionary tale for children to be good is very, very clear, but it's so scary. It to the point where I'm just like, like this is definitely like a very brilliant tool of the church to get people to fall in line and behave and not question.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. If you look at just all the versions of Little Red Riding Hood, and there is some serious gruesomeness in just that one story alone. Cinderella, Snow White, both of them are pretty gruesome as well. Um,
Mhm.
all of them. So it's one of the things I love to do is go back and look at some of the more original states
Mhm.
of fairy tales, but then also reading modern retellings of fairy tales and
Yeah.
fantasy and things like that and mythology. So I would
Yeah.
love to see somebody do a retelling of something like The Last Unicorn, which is still pretty modern because, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't a
Right.
couple hundred years ago. It was within my lifetime that it was written. But I'd love to see somebody, go, okay, culture has changed. Let's do a retelling, and how that might change the story from our current modern perspective.
Yeah, I love retellings. Now we're getting away
Mhm.
from our topic, but in general, I love retellings because it's so interesting to take a classic, if you will, I'll use that in air quotes, because again, we're taught the classics are from white men from Europe, um, and make them more fun. Like, William Shakespeare, my favorite, I own so many versions of Taming of the Shrew. It's not even funny. Like, whether it's a
Yeah.
book or a movie, I don't know why that's my favorite, but it is. And I just love the way that when you do bring a current lens to an old story and the
Mm-hmm.
creativity that's within that, I think that's a level of creativity that people don't appreciate in the same way as we do of original creativity. And
Mm-hmm.
man, if someone's listening and they decide that they want to do a close reading of The Last Unicorn and do a modern retelling, we are here for it.
Well, and I always love the retellings when it's from the point of view of the villain. Usually because women are cast as the villain, so I like
Right.
that. And I'm like, there's a backstory on this. So it's like with The Last Unicorn, the villain is the king, but also the Red Bull. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, what if they told the story from the perspective of the Red Bull? Maybe the Red Bull was not really thrilled with what he was tasked to do. And how did he feel
Right.
about that? So
Yeah. See, we've already got your story prompt for you.
go out there and write
Go out there and
it.
write it and then contact Jackie and me and we can interview about it and we can read it with you. It's gonna be great. Well, Jackie, I'm so thankful for you for one bringing up this topic, The Last Unicorn. I didn't realize how much I needed a flashback to the 80s. Uh, and two, for coming on and talking about it just in general. And I would love for you to tell our friends at home where they can find you, follow you, support you, and keep up with you if they want to.
The easiest place to find me, except for in the last couple of weeks,
Yeah.
is on Instagram. I'm generally pretty regular on there, especially in my stories. So it's Jacki Hayes _OBM. So
And we will link in the show notes so it's easy for you to find it. Jackie's going to be on our sister show, Pop Culture Makes Me Jealous, where we talk about Inside Out. When that episode airs, you'll want to take a listen because it's a really great episode. So find Jackie, support her work, see what she's up to. She offers a lot of really great information if you are launching things, which is hard.
yeah, yes, it is. Doesn't have
Hard
to be though.
doesn't have to be, and she makes it easier for you. I want to thank my guest, Jackie, again for coming on the show. She's also going to be on Pop Culture Makes Me Jealous, where we discuss Inside Out. It's December, which means we do not have book club this month, but we'll be back in January. If you are craving our book discussions, Join us on Patreon and listen to our book club replays. If you love our show and want more of it, you can join us on Patreon, patreon.com/Julia Washington, and you'll get bonus episodes every month, a live monthly book club discussion, access to those replays, and so much more. Just look for the book club tier. If you're not ready to commit, no problem. You can join our community for free and still get content, just not as frequently. Also, our next virtual reading salon is December 16th at 2 p.m. To get the info to join, you got to get on our mailing list. You'll be sent the links a few days before. Our first in-person reading salon is coming in February of 2024. Tickets will be on sale very, very soon, and you'll buy those at juliawashingtonproductions.com. Friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time.